making sense of the madness. We got a great show lined up for you today. We got Colonel Grant Newsham. The new book is When China Attacks, A Warning to America. You're not going to want to miss it. Buckle up and get ready to make sense of the madness. We are back. We are joined by Colonel Grant Newsham. Before we get into the book, the title, the subject matter, the fact that we allegedly have a Chinese spy arrest in New York City recently involving Kathy Hochul and her staff, tell us about yourself. You obviously have a long and storied career, and then why you decided to write this book.
Sure. I was obviously with the Marines for many years. Both on active duty and as a reservist, though during the so-called war on terrorism, you could come on active duty as often as you wanted. So I had several sort of jobs or careers. Was with the Marines, was the sort of reserve head of intelligence for all of the Asia Pacific for a while. I was also the Marine attaché in Tokyo, spent 25 years almost living in Tokyo, and also helped the Japanese create their amphibious force. They didn't have one. It was considered taboo, but I and a couple others and some Japanese people thought they needed one, so we gave them one. But also I was a U.S. diplomat, was in the Foreign Service, and also was with an investment bank, Morgan Stanley, in Japan for about a decade, and also worked for Motorola. People used to know that company. It committed suicide in China. These days
I remember Motorola, the original Razor, right? Before the smartphone, the flip phone that took over the world. With all that experience, I mean, not only in the military, but the private sector in Japan, you've obviously been immersed in Asian culture, although obviously there's a differing culture between Japan and China. What are those differences? What can you say about the culture there that differs from from China?
Sure. Well, one is that it's hard to describe, but the Japanese are quiet, unless you really get them angered. But it's a very quiet society. People avoid confrontation. They will do anything to avoid embarrassment. And you see that at the personal level and the government level, they won't speak up for themselves. And there's a restraint there. And in China, it's the opposite. If you want to hear what people think, they'll tell you. And they'll even make it up if they need to. But there's sort of an aggressiveness in the Chinese culture that you don't find in the Japanese culture, which is strange when you think about history in World War II, etc. But maybe in Japan it's better hidden. It's really more than anything, it's the nature of the two governments. The Japanese government is a friend of the United States. It does not seek to dominate or control Asia or anywhere else. It's a democracy, a consensual government, has a legal system that works. China is none of those. It seeks to dominate the region, dominate the world. It wants to knock the United States off of its perch, and China wants to dominate. There's no legal system in China. Contract means nothing more than what Xi Jinping, the dictator, says it means. China has black prisons. The law is really a tool to control the population. It's a repressive, aggressive, expansionist, totalitarian dictatorship, like George Orwell would have written about if he could have imagined such a thing. But back to your question of why I wrote the book. Obviously, I've spent 40 plus years looking at Asia, and a lot of that was looking at China as well. I've always looked at the whole map, even though I lived in Japan for a long time and worked closely with the Japanese and the Japanese military. And when I was asked to write the book, but once I was asked, I thought, well, what is it people would like to know? And I say the people who don't live and breathe foreign affairs, who don't live and breathe Asia, what is it about China that I think they should know? So I wrote it as if I was writing to what you'd call regular people. I suppose I'm regular people too. It's how I always write. But I wanted to explain to Americans, what is it about China that we need to worry about? What sort of trouble have we gotten into with them? Is it too late? And also to offer some solutions of how we can get out of the mess we got ourselves into. I would note that when that spy balloon came over the United States last year, that a lot of Americans looked up and they said, what is it about China? Well, this book pretty much tells you what it is about China that you need to know.
Well, I want to get into the aspects that I'm concerned about China. I do want to say I don't believe that was a Chinese spy balloon. I believe the Hirsch explanation, but that's a side issue. I am worried about the fact that we have a nation of 1.3 billion people that is highly organized, has a first world military, is essentially a one-party system, and has adopted a social credit score on a mass level years and years ago. How much that's actually evolved and integral in everyday society with every citizen, I guess I don't know. I'm not there. I'm also kind of beholden to media reports. I try not to submerge myself into just somebody's opinion and what's actually going on. But really, when the World Economic Forum, which to me is just the mouthpiece for the globalist agenda, is telling everybody that China is the model, that is also a very worrying aspect. At the same time, it seems almost a dichotomy that is the society where you're saying that more people will tell you what they think and feel like they can express themselves openly, as opposed to Japan, which is supposed to have, a democratically run government for and by the people. Why do you think that is? And do you feel like the things I've mentioned are the main concerns when it comes to China?
Well, first, I better the Japanese, it's by nature, are unwilling or they're resistant to letting out their thoughts, their inner thoughts, to somebody that they don't know. So that's just character. That's the nature. And in China, I do want to stress that government is all about control, and that people are very careful what they will say because of the threat, the fear. But if you're dealing with, say, Chinese people in business or anywhere else, in a certain setting, that they're more outgoing, more gregarious, and that's a better way to put it. But the Chinese regime is all about control, and it is getting into everybody's life, and that's the nature of a communist regime. It wants to make sure that there's no threat to its power, and it has been very effective. You first using human resources to control people, what they say, and punish them if they say the wrong things. And now it has very successfully used technology to get that control into many, many parts of life. So I just wanted to point that out. It is very much it's a question. It's more sort of personality is a better way to put it. And it's just different places in that sense. But in terms of the Chinese being subject to a very restrictive regime, that's the reality of China. Japan does not have that. People are not restrained from what they say. It's just they generally don't want to, unless they know you pretty well. So I just wanted to clarify that. And this is what the Chinese regime is all about. And everything is about making sure that there's no threat to the Chinese Communist Party. And they will do anything to make sure that doesn't build up. We saw that in the response to, well, you see it in daily life all the time, but you saw their COVID response, which was their usual system on steroids, where, welding people into their apartments until they starved to death. But the electronic aspect of their sort of repressive system is most impressive. If you were to type in something like into your internet, Winnie the Pooh looks like Xi Jinping, you would have the police at your door in about 5 minutes and your internet cut and the like. But the social credit system that you mentioned
before we get into the social credit system, I want to highlight the internet thing, because I think that's really important. For those that don't know, There's a big gag over in China running well over a decade that Xi Jinping looks like Winnie the Pooh. So Winnie the Pooh has been banned. South Park many years ago did a parody series on this that got South Park banned almost immediately in China. Those things are extremely troubling, okay, when we're talking about the internet. However, I would point out that I remember it was either 2017 or 18 that Eric Schmidt was running Google at the time, got put on the spot by the BBC about Dragonfly. And Dragonfly at the time was the censored version of the internet that Google had worked on. Didn't want to comment, wanted to pass the buck to Sergey Brin. I don't know anything about it. I would argue, all right, no one's showing up to our doors yet for such things. But I don't even call it Chinese-style censorship. We see what's on Google. Try finding the same things that you found 5-10 years ago that go against the official narrative. It's almost impossible. I mean, that system of control and censorship via Dragonfly has made its way to the United States. Am I wrong in pointing that out?
No. It may not have made it in its fullest form, but if you wanted to see something fuller or close to that, look what they did, what happened in Canada during the truckers' strike. That is something that the Chinese would have recognized and would have applauded. I mean, shutting down people's bank accounts, going after people who made contributions to these people. The things that were done up there are things that you could have, say, looked for a model to China, to communist China, I'll put it that way, and that's always important to remember. So the answer to your question is unfortunately not.
All right.
So this is scary.
And I think that's important to point out because, you know, when we talk about these companies and we talk about collusion with government, we often talk as though, well, they're sold on the NASDAQ and they're sold on Wall Street, so they're private companies. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, well, first of all, we used to break up private companies that were monopolies. And Google, I mean, you want to talk about a monopoly. It is a technopoly like the likes of which we've never seen. Number one search engine in the world with Google. Number two search engine in the world with YouTube, which is also the number one video platform in the world. Number one operating system on the most devices, if you count Android and Chrome together as an operating system, which they both own. Chrome has basically infiltrated our entire public education system from K through 12. And I haven't even named a dozen other subsidiaries in the fact that really Google came up through In-Q-Tel, the investment wing of the CIA. That's never getting broken. I didn't even mention they have NASA contracts with quantum computing and artificial intelligence that date back over a decade and claim quantum supremacy in 2019. I mean, we keep going, but I don't see any hopes of that company being broken up or meaningfully regulated. Hell, I didn't even mention the fact that, you know, a couple times you had Google employees walk out because they didn't want to program autonomous drones that would be used in warfare. So when you have a company like that, not only operating in the United States, but globally, isn't that ultra problematic? I mean, when we talk about the merging of these systems and the ideal set of China or a social credit score coming here, something like Google is integral, no?
Well, unfortunately, you're right. I never thought this would happen in my lifetime. But the potential for that is there, and I think we've seen signs of what can be done. You know, look at what happened during the Chinese virus, the COVID business. Say the wrong thing, and you're silenced, and have wrong thoughts, improper thoughts, and well, nobody can hear you. And that is really just, I'm afraid, a tip of what is possible to a certain type of government, even in a Western consensual democracy. And it is something that I think we need to be afraid of. As I said, it never crossed my mind this could happen in my lifetime.
Well, we're here. We're going to take a quick break. The book is When China Attacks, A Warning to America. When we come back, I want to delve into the social credit score, what it is, what it means, and whether or not we'll see it here. Folks, I got news for you. You've already got social credit scores based on your little magic devices, including through Apple for over a decade. Yeah, you're not being at the loss of flying right now or unable to travel or get a bank account yet. But again, we saw what happened during the COVID-19 84 nightmare, the wrong trigger, and it could all come down very, very rapidly. We will be back with more Making Sense of the Madness after this.
The world is about to shift. Banks are going cashless globally with the emergence of central bank digital currency, which will bring with it programmable money and the ability to turn on or off your purchasing power based on your digital social profile. It's like the equivalent of spyware in your bank account. You need to get out of the system with the world's safest and most precious assets, silver and gold. Call Kirk Elliott Precious Metals at 720-605-3900. That's 720-605-3900.
Attention business owners, are you ready to advertise to millions of loyal patriots ready to buy your products or services? Here is your golden chance to advertise with Jason Bermas and connect with his massive audience on Patriot TV and his incredibly loyal social media followers. As an advertiser on Making Sense of the Madness, you also reach his followers on the top social media sites. As Jason dives into complex current events and conspiracies, offering investigative analysis and thought-provoking discussions to uncover the deeper truths behind the headlines. When you advertise with Jason on Making Sense of the Madness, you're aligning your brand with integrity, loyalty, and a dedication to truth. Jason's audience is passionate, conservative, and committed to the values your business stands for. When given the choice, Jason's followers will buy your products or services over other woke companies. Don't miss this opportunity to elevate your brand with the power of Patriot TV. Reach out to us today at advertise@patriot.tv.
And we are back with Colonel Grant Newsham. Grant, I was just talking about the social credit score aspect, and really now China has been rocking this thing almost a decade in incremental value systems. But I remember doing stories 5-6 years ago where you would be in the urban areas and somebody would jaywalk or smoke in the wrong place, and immediately they would be publicly shamed on a screen, and then money would be deducted from their account. That is certainly a place I never want to get to in the United States. However, I already see microcosms of it in places like New York that I moved from. They just started this year that if you're driving in the wrong place in New York City, you got to pay. And all the toll booths are gone with people. You're paying the toll no matter what. You're just driving through. You get a bill in the mail. You don't have to have a New York license or anything like that. So to some extent, these things are coming into play. And like you noted, in Canada, our neighbor to the north, people were debanked, etc. In this country, I had my GoFundMe taken away. My YouTube channel got not only demonetized, but taken 5 separate times. The only way I was able to get it back for wrongthink was to shame them on another social media platform, Twitter at the time. And you have to have an audience to do that. They don't care about you. So you literally have to have other people shame them on another platform just to maybe kind of sort of get not really freedom of reach, as they call it, Linda Yaccarino, but the slightest bit of freedom of speech. And that's the only game in town. Let's be honest. I mean, I know that some people are now making money on Rumble and Twitter. When you talk about YouTube and Google, if you have a business that has an online presence and you can't use Google AdSense, you're probably not going to be able to compete. And I would argue the second largest one that you would use online would be Facebook. And they are basically in line with their terms and services through collusion, which should also be illegal. So you can't really advertise there. Aren't these things all kind of soft social credit scores that have already been imposed on American citizens?
Well, yes, they are. You look at how we're even careful about what we write in an email. One of my colleagues said, at least back in the olden days, the KGB had to do some work. These days, we write our dossiers for ourselves. And you are correct. It never crossed my mind I would have to think about what I wrote in a message other than what simple decency obligated me. Regarding China, there's a very good U.S. Sort of YouTube out show called China Unscripted, China Uncensored, which is probably the single best outlet. It explains China, that exposes what the Chinese Communist Party is, what it's up to. There's about a year and a half ago, they did a GoFundMe campaign for someone who was resisting the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, in the Pacific. they couldn't get the money released. GoFundMe just refused to do it. And so they called up, they got the US Congress involved. And suddenly the money was magically released. But this gives you this is just one tiny example of what is being done, and just really a harbinger of what will be done in the future if things continue on this trend line.
Well, let's talk about that future, because that future is almost the past in China. As I alluded to, they've instituted that social credit score in a way where you may not be able to travel on a train or a plane. Your child may not be able to go to the university that you would like them to go if, in fact, your social credit score is not high enough and you are the wrong kind of political dissident. What are some other aspects to that social credit score, and how far has it gone? Has it gone to the level of imprisonment and even execution?
Yes. There's some people who spoke up about the Chinese virus that originated in Wuhan, China, and tried to just explain what had happened and release some of the information. Well, at least one of them, a young lady, was put into a prison, a mental prison, of course, and came out basically impaired forever. People who disappear into black prisons, political dissidents, or dissidents, which just means you have some sort of unauthorized thought. They disappear into black prisons, regular prisons. You have the Uyghurs, the Muslims from the western part of China that China has occupied. There's about 1 million of them in concentration camps. Their crime, well, big Muslim Uyghurs, potentially a threat to Chinese Communist Party control. These are a few examples, and there's just no shortage of them, actually. There's a mass roundup of lawyers probably 6-7 years ago. These were lawyers who were calling for the sorts of rights we would recognize. Mass roundup, some of them imprisoned, all of them put out of work. You had a Nobel Prize winner who was simply pushing for more freedoms in China. He was imprisoned and not given medical treatment and allowed to die. Yes, this regime will play rough, make no mistake. And when I say rough, this is like something we thought the world was done with in 1945, but not at all.
Again, one of the biggest concerns I have when these things are taking place, you mentioned 1 million Uyghurs, and you still have demonstrations for years with Falun Gong in places like New York City, et cetera. You've actually seen quite a bit of Chinese Americans get behind Trump and MAGA every time I've went to cover, a Stop the Steal rally or one of those things in DC. They're there in abundance. So there does seem to be some kind of a pushback. But how meaningful is that pushback? I remember discussing this with a writer from the Epoch Times before you had that arrest on the supposed money laundering, and he was from China. And, I wanted to know firsthand experience. He said, especially in the religious realms, they don't want you to worship a single deity. You just mentioned Muslim Uyghurs, and they want you to be more about spirituality in more of an open sense and not that regimented type of religion. When you talk about the type of society that China is it pushed away from that type of monotheistic religion regardless and into that spirituality realm? And if so, why?
Well, it's a good question. There is sort of a real appeal for something other than the communist belief. And communism it's a European belief. It's a foreign belief. And to pretend otherwise is wrong. But there's always been a sort of a yearning for something different. And there's been a certain appeal to communism, but even the traditional religions are things that give people satisfaction. And it is not just Islamic people that are being pressured and murdered, their organs taken. It's Christians in China as well. The Catholic Church is actually, the Roman Catholic Church has rolled over and said, yeah, you can, to the Communist Party, yes, you can authorize who our bishops are, and you can monitor us and the like. So the Chinese will allow some sort of a weird kind of Christianity to exist, but it is something that people want to have. I'd call it this yearning for freedom. It's yearning for something more than the materialism of a communist regime. What did the Chinese people think? Well, obviously, as in any society, a lot of people go along with things just so they don't get in trouble, keep their head down, like Eastern Europe used to be when the Russians were there. But there's many, many that you can see who have left China, communist China, and want to be free. There is a huge aspect of that. And what these people are doing to try and push back a bit, it has its limits, as long as the U.S. government, which is the one or outfit that can give some impetus to what these people are trying to do, as long as it remains relatively mute about the nature of the Chinese communist regime, and it allows say the communist regime to send its people over to America and elsewhere to harass, intimidate, and violently handle anyone who challenges them. And that's what we are seeing with these overseas police stations. They call them something else that they found in the United States and 70 some throughout the world that they've located. And the arrest of the New York governor's aide just the other day is part and parcel of that effort to suppress the overseas Chinese diaspora. People, many of whom have gone for more than just economic opportunity. They simply want freedom. And they go to the one place they're sure they'll be free, and they find that the Beijing's minders are there and ready to cause them a lot of trouble. So many of the people who do leave China, it's not just for economic opportunity to have a job or to have money. They leave because they want to be free. They want to get away from the Chinese Communist Party. So it's ironic that they go to the one place where they think they're going to be free, and they find that Beijing secret police are still going after them. And the FBI knows this. They know what's going on. They haven't dug into this at any level that as they should. But this is what's happening to them in America. So where exactly do you run? Another aspect of this that's always I found funny, but it's also a real vulnerability of the Chinese Communist Party's elite, is that for probably 30 years at least, everyone in China who has tried to get their money out of the country, tried to get their wealth out of the country, tried to get a relative out with a green card, and they buy real estate in the United States, the UK, Singapore, Australia, Canada, and places that they say is their enemy, but they sure all want to go live there, and that includes the most successful people in that system. So that suggests that there isn't all that much confidence in the future, even by the people who are benefiting the most from it. It's a bit like a futures market, if you read it that way. But we have not capitalized on this, but it's a huge vulnerability for the Chinese Communist Party.
We got to take a break. When China Attacks, A Warning to America is the book. When we come back, I want to talk about the evolution of modern day China, where it was when I was a kid and where it is today, more making sense of the madness after this.
What if this happened to you when you're alone? Or what if it happened here? With MedGuard Alert, you're never alone. You can connect with medical professionals anywhere, anytime. And now MedGuard is introducing our exclusive new CareWatch. If you need help quickly, use it from anywhere to contact medical professionals. No cell phone required. The CareWatch is not only a life-saving medical alert device, it's a revolutionary health monitoring system that checks your blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, and much more. And here's the best part. If you have Medicaid, you may qualify to get your CareWatch for free. The CareWatch is only available through MedGuard Alert. Call us right now. We have monitoring programs starting as low as $1 a day. The call is free, activation is free, shipping is free, and no contract is required. Remember, with Medicaid, you may qualify to get your CareWatch for free. Don't wait. Call us to get your CareWatch right now. Operators are standing by.
I don't know about you, but I have to have that cup of coffee in the morning. And Kingdom Cup is mold-free, it is pesticide-free, and it is organic. It's got this flavor that is delicious. You don't even have to put cream or sweetener in it.
Why did we go with the bean form, the whole bean? Because ultimately the powder form is the one that gathers the most moisture. And that means the more potential mold development. This is actually organic, mold-free, certified. That's important because ultimately people drink coffee, it's cultural. And so we tried to meet the culture where it is and create a healthy alternative.
Make the healthy choice for you and your family. Try mold-free, pesticide-free, and it's organic. Delicious Kingdom Cup coffee. And it's available now at the Patriot TV store. Go to patriot.tv and click on store. You'll find Kingdom Cup coffee in the health and wellness section. Order Kingdom Cup coffee at the Patriot TV store now.
And we are back. Now, when I was a kid, and we were in, I remember global studies. I remember ninth grade. Here we are, late 80s. I guess early 90s. I was born in 79. And I get my first look at the rest of the world, China in particular. And we're watching old school reels, and they're talking about one-child policies. And in large part, they're showing areas that look like a second and third world. Nothing like what you see in modern China today. And, as I got into more global history, and I saw especially what happened under the Nixon administration via Kissinger, and really this Rockefeller type thought process, where all of a sudden we were going over there, we were getting deregulations. They're allowed to have Coca-Cola and blue jeans and McDonald's and soft capitalism. But then I've seen us as a society and government kind of slide more to the authoritarian realm. Am I crazy for thinking that? Or has it really been that slow progression from, say, the 70s into the 90s into this modern day system?
You're basically correct. Whether one could, of course, debate how what's happened to us, but in terms of China, it's like what you described. It was until about 1980 was third world, to put it mildly, just about everywhere, and that was thanks to the Chinese Communist Party, which starved to death or murdered at least 50 million of its citizens in peacetime and good weather. But the idea was, when the Americans got into it with Nixon and Kissinger and then subsequent administrations, the idea was that, well, if China gets economically stronger, as China prospers, it will become more liberalized. It'll become like a giant Canada, or like Canada used to be. And that was the hypothesis. So that is why the U.S. government encouraged U.S. businesses to pour into China, like my old company, Motorola, to go in there and make the Chinese prosperous. And that was going to cause the Chinese Communist Party to become irrelevant. Well, that didn't happen. What it did was it funded China's economic growth, and the natural industriousness of the Chinese people kicked in once the Chinese Communist Party stopped killing them in such large numbers, just let some of their, as I say, industriousness go to work. And plus American money, American technology, American business, along with Western and Japanese money, technology, and business, that is what supercharged or fueled China's growth from about 1980 to what it is today. But it also funded the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military. So this success that we see today, that the China that you see today, is very much a creation of the West. Without it, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have any special sort of economic wisdom that would have allowed them to turn China into what it's become. But you also have to remember that this idea that China is a huge shining success is actually an illusion, in large part. And there was a prominent Chinese official who just a couple of years ago, he noted that in a speech that, well, he said something like 600 million Chinese still live on $5 a day or less. And that is not much money. So if you get away from the Shanghai, the Shenzhens, that you will, and into other parts of China, you will see some places that still look pretty miserable. So it's hard to call it a great the success that really, I would say, Americans who are vested in this illusion of a successful China, usually there's a financial connection. It's not all it seems to be. And if you cut off that flow, continuing flow of convertible currency, US dollars, and technology, the Chinese Communist Party will be hard pressed to maintain sort of the growth that it's had.
Well, aside from the poverty that you discussed, China also has overbuilt in many areas, and they have these vast ghost cities that are simply not populated. No one likes to talk about that aspect or where they are financially right now. Obviously, the Chinese Communist Party wants to present the most strength and are not admitting to a lot of their economic woes, but I would argue they are seeping through into the mainstream. That being said, one of the things we didn't talk about is Hong Kong. I did a story on Hong Kong just this past week. It seems very culturally different than it did 4 or 5 years ago when it was out there protesting. In fact, those protests no longer exist. And a lot of people don't historically understand how Hong Kong was under British rule, I believe, for 100 years through this treaty, and then forced to give back to China. Obviously, the people living there were not too fond of that idea. But at the end of the day, Chinese Communist Party came in, and you can see visually that authoritarian system has, in fact, not only made its mark, it's pretty much fully taken over there.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. I think anybody with any sense knew what was going to happen in Hong Kong when it was turned over in 1997, despite the Communist Party's promises. That it would have its separate system for at least 50 years, that you knew they weren't going to keep the promise. They never do. And gradually, if you went to Hong Kong in that era, you saw that every time you went back, it was a little bit different. It was a little more like a Chinese city. And then when those freedom protests broke out a few years ago, that at that point, when you saw what the vast majority of people in Hong Kong wanted was just to be free. And then you knew, however, that once the Chinese communists caught their breath, that they were going to come back full force and go after anyone who was involved in that movement and use those tools of repression, use their social credit capabilities, and also the just arresting people and leaders and anyone involved in this. And you knew that they were going to be able to snuff it out. And that's pretty much what is done. There's, of course, Westerners and Western businessmen there who still hope to make some money out of it all, and they'll overlook any sort of inhumanity. But the Hong Kong that anyone knew is gone. It's just become another big Chinese city. Maybe it's got just a few more years to really finish it off, but it's not at all what it was. And the custom has sort of cast this blanket over the place, and it's hard to see how that's going to open up again.
Now, we've got this recent story out of New York City where you have this alleged Chinese spy working within the Kathy Hochul administration. I will admit, I have not dug very deep. I think there's probably, of course, more to the story, and I don't necessarily think that this is unique. Socially, culturally, politically, economically, how far has the Chinese Communist Party infiltrated the United States? Is this the rule rather than the exception? Can we expect to find more and more of these types of people and influences in important government agencies, administrations, etc.? And one of the things that kind of alarmed me about this whole thing is this person's not in jail. Now, it seems like if you believe this person is involved in all sorts of treasonous activities, is involved in our government, at the very least, you're going to hold this person. And yet they got bail like everybody else. I mean, that seems troubling to me, but I'd also like you to answer the first question as well.
Yeah, well, she didn't murder anybody, so I guess she doesn't get bail, or she isn't anything to worry about. But this is the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. She just happened to get caught. There's thousands more of her, and it's all part of a Chinese systematic influence effort. And it's about influence and control. And that is what people like her do. and she was in place for a long time. You saw how she was able to affect New York State policy towards Taiwan, and toward Taiwan, for example, making sure human rights were never mentioned, making sure that American leaders met with all of the Chinese officials and bigwigs, etc., turning America's elite class, the political ruling class, so that they were supporters completely of the Chinese Communist Party. They may not have known it, what they were doing, but they willingly went along with it. Not least, people like her were seen to have some access to the Chinese local Chinese American or Chinese population, and be a source of funds. But this got everyone in New York to shut up about Chinese human rights that are ghastly, and also to give Taiwan the cold shoulder. This place with 23 million free Chinese people of Chinese origin living under democracy and consensual government. And we treated them like they were lepers, and it was the whispering by these people, such as that lady who was arrested the other day. But this is very much the MO of how the PRC operates. And you would note, for example, there was the case of Senator Dianne Feinstein's aide. It was her driver, allegedly, for 20 years. And he was her driver, but he also represented her at events within the Chinese community, events at the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. He was a Chinese spy, and the FBI even woke up and caught him. And she was, remember, the head of, or very prominent in the Senate Intelligence Committee. That's one example of how they insert people into just about any level of American society, any level of American government, who will whisper, who will influence and shade the way that American officials think.
Let me just stop you on Dianne Feinstein, because, there's another example of somebody that clearly wasn't running anything, probably the last year, maybe 2 years of her being in office, right? Talk about Dementia Joe. Obviously, the media didn't hit that, but if you were watching her, she couldn't speak, etc. Why is it that something like that is allowed and that person is able to maintain their office after the fact? If you have foreign influence on a daily basis on a politician that is literally 1 out of 100, that is, don't get me wrong, Congress would be very, very bad too. But when we're talking about the Senate, it's very, very important. They know about all these things. It's clear this person doesn't have their faculties, and they've had the influence of a foreign government for how long? Why isn't that person? First of all, we don't have a fourth estate that's doing their job and letting the American people know that's going on. But you would think the people on the ground would do enough that person would at least be removed, and yet we didn't see that.
Well, that's a failing of our system, and it really is disgraceful. I would, as you touched on it, there's the press. We used to have investigative reporters. We used to have a press that looked to make a name for themselves by exposing this. Not anymore. And as a result, this sort of thing can continue, and you do get this just embarrassing cover-up on Capitol Hill by a lot of people who should know better. And back to Dianne Feinstein, it's widely believed that at least one of her close relatives made a whole lot of money from doing business in China. The Republicans have their names as well. Mitch McConnell has been associated with Chinese wealth also, and it seems to have shaped some of his attitudes towards the Chinese Communist Party. Peter Schweitzer has written excellent books on this, naming names, and nobody has ever sued him, which tells you something. But the fact that somebody manifestly just incompetent in the literal sense and figurative sense, it was allowed to continue in those positions for that long. And I think we've also seen that at even a higher level. But this is something that America ought to look back on if we last long enough and be mightily embarrassed. Or I would say America's ruling class, and to include the media. They should be mightily embarrassed about what's happened here.
Well, the media at this point, especially the mainstream media, is nothing more than a talking head for the establishment narrative 90+% of the time. And even the local media has kind of succumbed to that, overwhelmingly so too. I'm not in love with the independent media, even though I'm a part of that as well. They like to run with narratives that are not always based in reality and unfortunately divisive. We got to take one last break. When China attacks, a warning to America. is the book. We'll be back with the final segment with Colonel Grant Newsham after this.
Throughout history, the spirit of patriotism has prevailed. The battles may have changed, but the values remain the same. Today, in 2024, we find ourselves at a pivotal moment where the call for unity, freedom, and a better future echoes louder than ever. For more than 10 years, Patriot Mobile has been committed to supporting the values that make our nation great. With affordable plans and reliable nationwide coverage, Patriot Mobile is not just a wireless service. It's a call to action for those who believe in the American dream. Because this year is not just any year, it's the most important year since our nation's founding. Choose a wireless carrier that shares your values. Choose Patriot Mobile.
Did you know that thousands of authors across the country have written books and published them with Page Publishing? If you've written a book, Page Publishing can help you through the process. We cut through the confusion of the publishing world to make it easy for you. If we decide to publish your book, your work ends and ours begins. From copy editing and proofing to typesetting and book cover art, we get you printed, distributed, and sold on Amazon, Apple iTunes, and in bookstores across the country. We'll even help you promote your book. That's right, we do all this for you. Biography, self-help, mystery, novels, sci-fi, even a children's book. No matter what genre, Page Publishing can bring your book to life. Call today for your free author submission kit and find out how you can be the next published author at Page Publishing.
Call for your free author submission kit at 855-993-2114. That's 855-993-2114.
And we are back. We've got about 10 minutes left in the broadcast. Obviously, we are in one of, if not the most bizarre election cycles of all time. Certainly in my lifetime after 2020, which at the time was probably the most bizarre out there. We got a guy who's a former president who just survived an assassination attempt that may be sentenced to prison in a couple weeks as the front runner on one end. On the other end, we have somebody that didn't receive a single vote from a single American citizen to be the nominee of her party, and obviously will not only maintain, but I would argue accelerate the agenda over the last 4 years, which she really had nothing to do with, and her boss had nothing to do with. I mean, this is about as empty a vessel politically as possible. That being said, if Trump gets in, how much can he do to fight this type of agenda? He's been out there, talked about he doesn't want a CBDC. I don't think he quite understands that. He's going to be tough with China. He's going to stop these wars. They all sound good. And quite frankly, I would argue, as many of the problems that Trump may have had during his presidency, hands down the best president of my lifetime. Okay? If Trump gets in there, and that's win in November, sworn in January, are there steps to combat this agenda meaningfully? If that does not happen, and you get Kamala Harris in there, how quickly does this agenda accelerate, and how quickly do you think we're forced to adopt more Chinese-style policies?
Well, I think it could go pretty quickly. If you look at how fast things went downhill during the COVID business, people just willingly rolled over to governments at all levels doing things that were just egregious affronts to American liberties, both physical and mental. And they did it without batting an eye, and they'd have done more of it if they could have gotten away with it. And I think we will see more of that, things along, all intended for control and to sort of rein in the way that Americans think, to only think authorized thoughts. And I would point out that with the vice president candidate, Mrs. Harris's vice president Waltz, he couldn't get a job on the loading dock at the CIA or anywhere else. I don't see how he has a security clearance. If you look at his connections to China, over an extended period of time that he really hasn't explained very well. Many of his statements are extremely troubling as well. So that is, if you look at if you know how the Chinese operate their influence operations, he is just a classic case. You take somebody when they're young, you build a relationship with them, and over time you stoke it, you tend to it, and you might get lucky, and he may end up running for vice president of the U.S. Now, in terms of Mr. Trump, what could he do? He would have his work cut out for him. Make no mistake. Things have gone that far. But I would note when it comes to China, and that is the one big threat that I think we face. There's maybe some others, and I certainly would accept those arguments. But in terms of China, he was the first administration of anyone in my lifetime that the Chinese were afraid of. They weren't afraid of Ronald Reagan very much, but that was just the nature of things at the time. But nobody since then.
Before you say Reagan, wouldn't you also argue, a lot of people don't know this, but George H.W. Bush, before he could get elected, he was trying to be a senator before all these other things. He was an envoy to China for the United Nations. He was somebody that spent a lot of time there. So I would also argue that there was a close relationship there. And obviously, Bush is not only the vice president for 8 years, he becomes the president for 4 more, correct?
Oh, yeah. I was just given we didn't have all that much time, I could probably speak all day about this stuff. Yes, Mr. Reagan, he knew about communism and he brought it down. But at the same time, he was part of that belief that if we accommodate China, they'll become nice. So he authorized the sale of, say, torpedo technology, artillery shell manufacturing technology to the Chinese. And he shouldn't have done that. It was a mistake. But George H.W. Bush, yes, he had served in China for something like 18 months and thought he knew the place, thought they loved him. And what I would direct anybody to is the letter he wrote to Deng Xiaoping immediately after the Tiananmen Square massacre. It's on the internet, and go read that thing. And it gives the word bootlick a new meaning. And that was George H.W. Bush. I highly recommend you read it, and you'll see why we got into this mess that we're in. But back to Mr. Trump, he was the first president that the Chinese really didn't like. And they didn't like the people who were advising him. And there were some excellent people handling China and Asian policy for Trump. So he benefited from that. He was smart enough to listen to them. And the Chinese wanted those people off the battlefield, and they got their way. And keep in mind, the Trump administration only had 2 years really to go after China. And if they had another 3 or 4, it would have been very interesting to see what they could have done. But they were the first administration to stand up for U.S. interests, to do something about the Chinese economic assault on us, this full-bore political warfare campaign against the United States. The Trump administration not just pushed back, but they made the Chinese very, very uncomfortable. And if they can do that again, well, we do have a chance. But we're going to have to just do a couple basic things, is stop funding the People's Republic of China. Chinese money is worth nothing overseas, so they have to get US dollars. Reduce that supply of dollars, and they've got some problems. Put some real technology controls on what the Chinese can access, and you're going to start making a difference. But if we don't do that, China's going to keep at us, and it's going to get rough for us, I'm afraid.
Now, you mentioned Trump. You talk about that presidency, and I'm a big peace guy. I want talks. I want relationships. One of the things that I really was happy about is that this guy crossed the line into North Korea and shook Kim Jong-un's hand and had a conversation with the guy. Now, whether or not we were able to develop any meaningful foreign policy out of that is a whole other thing. South Korea, obviously, a very different place and very much a part of Western culture by its nature in technology and all these companies that are not quite Motorola, maybe a little bit bigger over there. What are your thoughts on North Korea, and can it ever kind of be brought into the Western fold, or is the Chinese influence just too much?
I don't think it can really be reformed. These kind of regimes, it generally takes some 7.62 ammunition to change them. I just don't see that happen. However, I thought it was very interesting when Mr. Trump at least made the effort to go see what was available, see what might be done. So must say I thought it was worth the try. But into the nature of these brutal regimes, they don't voluntarily give up power. And I don't think that North Korea is capable of forming. And as you said, the influence over North Korea is immense. Even without the Chinese, I don't think North Korea would reform. But with the PRC ultimately calling the shots in North Korea, they could close North Korea down in an afternoon by just cutting off the oil, the food, the electricity. But they have no interest in that. They're very happy to have it being such a distraction for the free world. But I don't see the possibility of reform. And when it comes to engagement or talks, the Chinese play the Americans very well on this. Is that it's partly our character that we think as long as we can talk to somebody, there's hope of working out any problems. The Chinese communists, and not just the Chinese communists, in business you see this as well, that this American desire to keep talking, it always leads to us making concessions, and usually for nothing more than the promise of future talks. I would suggest that for that theory, or my observation, that we do have some decades of empirical evidence to suggest how beneficial talking hasn't been with the PRC. They have their objectives, and they fully intend to accomplish them if they can. And as long as they can keep the Americans on the line, willing to talk, well, then they can keep doing what they're doing. They've built up a military that in some circumstances could defeat us. And that's all the while we've been talking to them. The Trump administration didn't do that, and the Chinese got very uncomfortable with it. So that would be my take on that. But often Americans in business and government just can't keep their mouths shut. And it works to our disadvantage, I'm afraid.
Well, let me just say this. I hope that the only solution to this Chinese problem is not a kinetic one, because I don't know what happens in that regard. No. Colonel Grant Newsham, thank you so much for joining us. The book is When China Attacks, A Warning to America. You know the deal with me. I hate them all. I don't like Republicans. I don't like Democrats, conservatives, liberals. All Johnny nonsense over here. It is not about left or right. It is always about right and wrong. I absolutely love you guys. And thanks for being with me here at Patriot.tv, where the truth lives 5 days a week. We'll see you on the flip side.